In a world where silence wants to find him, Michael Johnson breaks free from his fears and shatters expectations. Can he rise to the challenge, or will he be forgotten again? Find out now. Michael Johnson sat near the window of the classroom, the pencil in his hand tapping back and forth on the paper. He didn't feel nervous. It was just a habit, a way to focus, a way to think. His mother often told him he should break this habit, but it helped him stay alert and maintain his concentration when everything around him seemed to blur. The classroom at Crescent View High School in Denver, Colorado, was filled with the noise of students getting ready for class. But Michael didn't pay attention to the laughter and chatter of his friends. He was fixated on the board, his mind filled with that familiar feeling of anxiety. He wasn't the type to stand out in class. In fact, he wasn't the type to be noticed. He was a good student, always completing his assignments on time and consistently scoring high on tests, but he had never been truly recognized. By 10th grade, Michael had grown accustomed to feeling lost in a classroom full of other students. His history teacher, Ms. Patricia Williams, never called on him during class discussions. Even though he always raised his hand and had the correct answer, she never looked his way. His answers were never acknowledged, just quickly glossed over before she moved on to the next question. The other students didn't get treated like that, those with connections to the teachers, or simply the ones who spoke loudly and made an impression, always got more attention. Michael had learned to accept this. He never questioned why Ms. Williams didn't call on him, or why. When he gave an answer, she quickly overlooked him as if he didn't exist. It wasn't because he wasn't smart, but because he wasn't the type of person who easily drew attention. His mom had always told him to keep your head down, work hard, and stay out of trouble. And he had followed her advice. But that silence gradually became painful as each day passed. He felt more and more that he wasn't being properly valued. Like every other school day, Michael focused on a lesson in front of him, trying to finish his homework early as usual. But today, something was different. There was a tension in the air. And then, when Ms. Williams began her lecture on the American Civil War, everything changed. That day, everything seemed to shift. Ms. Patricia Williams, who had been teaching history at Crescent View High School in Denver, Colorado, started her lecture just like any other day. The students around Michael were still laughing and chatting about an upcoming party, but he wasn't paying much attention. He sat quietly, his hand still gently tapping the pencil on the page, his eyes focused on the book in front of him. Ms. Williams had been teaching for many years, and throughout that time, she had built a reputation as a strict but fair teacher, at least in the eyes of the students she favored. Michael had never been one of those students. He had grown used to being overlooked, ignored in the classroom. Every time he raised his hand to answer a question, she never looked his way, even though he knew the answer. His answers were never acknowledged, just quickly brushed aside before she moved on to the next question. Other students weren't treated like this. The ones who were loud or had connections with the teachers always received her special attention. Today, something felt different. Ms. Williams was lecturing about the American Civil War, but instead of breezing through as usual, she stopped and looked toward Michael. This felt strange to him. He couldn't avoid the growing anxiety in his chest, but he tried to stay calm. "Michael," Ms. Williams said, her voice stern but unfamiliar, "can you answer this question?" Suddenly, all eyes in the classroom turned toward him. Michael looked around, realizing everyone was paying attention to him. But there was no time to think too much. He took a deep breath, looked at the board, and began to answer. General Sherman's campaign in the South was aimed at breaking the resources and morale of the Confederate forces, he said, each word with confidence. In the end, the campaign helped the Union forces gain a decisive advantage in the war. Ms. Williams stared at him silently for a moment, her face giving away no emotion. Michael stood there, feeling a little uneasy. Part of him wondered if his answer was good enough, whether she would overlook him as usual. But there was something different in her gaze. She didn't quickly look away. "Not bad," she said, her voice lowering. "Not bad at all." Then she turned back to her lecture, giving him no further attention. Michael sat quietly, a strange feeling rising in his chest. He knew he had answered correctly, but her attitude made him feel as if nothing had changed. Deep down, though, He realized the day would be a different kind of day. The next day, the atmosphere in class felt unusually heavy. Michael walked into classroom, but this time, silence seemed to hang in the air. He could feel the gazes of his classmates, those furtive, curious looks, and even a few whispers began to ripple through the room as he walked in. It felt like he had become the center of attention. At that moment, Ms. Williams walked into the room, her usual serious demeanor in place. But today, something was different. She looked at Michael in a way that felt unfamiliar. Unlike before, she didn't just glance over him. This time, she stopped and her gaze made Michael feel like something was about to happen. She didn't speak immediately, letting the room settle for a moment. Once the class was calm, she opened her textbook and began her lecture on the American Civil War. Michael listened attentively, but his mind couldn't shake the thoughts of what had happened yesterday. It felt like everything was building up for some kind of turning point. Suddenly, in the middle of the lecture, Ms. Williams paused, turning toward Michael with a look that seemed to challenge him. "Michael," she said, her voice cold but with an undertone of curiosity, "can you play the piano for the class in the next session? I heard you're good at it, and maybe this will be your chance to prove it." Michael froze. The entire class went silent, and all eyes were on him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but on the outside, he tried to stay calm. You want me to play the piano?" Michael repeated, almost in disbelief. This wasn't a question, but a challenge. Ms. Williams gave a faint, humorless smile. "That's right. You said your grandfather was a musician, didn't you?" She replied, then paused for a moment, looking at him with a challenging gaze. "So show us. Tomorrow, you'll play a piece for class." Michael stared at her, feeling the challenge in her voice. Inside, he felt a mix of fear and anger, but he knew that if he refused, things would only get worse. He took a deep breath and nodded slightly. "Okay, Ms. Williams," Michael said, his voice low as he tried to maintain his composure. "I'll play tomorrow." The looks from his classmates only seemed to heighten the tension in the air. The classroom was no longer just a place for lessons. It had become a stage, and Michael would have to face everyone's expectations, especially those of his teacher, who had never fairly recognized him before. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Michael felt exhausted. He couldn't stop thinking about the next lesson, about playing the piano in front of the entire class. But deep inside, a fire was building up. He wouldn't let Ms. Williams or anyone in the class think that he couldn't do it. Tomorrow, he would prove that he was more than just an overlooked student. The next day, Michael walked into classroom with a heavy weight on his shoulders. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere the moment he stepped through the door. The curious looks from his classmates made him feel like he was walking into a battle he hadn't prepared for. Even though he had mentally prepared himself, now, standing before the whole class, his anxiety surged once again. "Are you really going to play?" Tyler Whitman, the guy sitting next to him, whispered, his eyes wide with surprise. Michael just gave a faint smile. "Maybe," he replied, trying to stay calm, even though the nervousness was rising uncontrollably inside him. His close friends had never shown him this much attention before. Even Brandon Hall, the class clown, was now looking at Michael with a curious gaze. When Ms. Williams walked into the classroom, everything seemed to stop. She appeared pleased to see the students settled, but her sharp eyes seemed to be waiting for something special. She looked at Michael once more, and then, without further word, she spoke. "Michael, today we'll have a special performance. Please play something for the class." The entire class went silent, no one daring to make a sound. Michael could feel all eyes on him, a strange sensation, knowing that everyone was waiting for him to fail. But instead of allowing himself to get caught up in the anxiety, Michael took a deep breath and walked toward the piano. A few students started whispering to each other. "He probably won't be able to do it," one murmured. "Yeah, who even knows how to play piano?" Another added. Michael didn't need to listen anymore, because he had decided that he wouldn't fail. He sat down at the piano, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched the cold keys. Michael looked around the classroom, and for a moment, he saw that the gazes weren't of doubt or mockery anymore. They were curious eyes, as if they wanted to know if he could actually do it. With a small nod, Michael began to play. His fingers glided across the keys, starting with a soft melody. each note ringing out like a whisper in the air. As the music played, the entire class seemed to stop breathing. The murmurs faded away, and all that was left was the sound of the piano. Michael wasn't just playing the piano. He was proving to himself that he wasn't just a forgotten student in this classroom. He had talent, and today he would show everyone that. Even though the old piano had worn keys and its sound wasn't as clear as a new one, to Michael, that didn't matter. The music came from his heart, and nothing could stop him from expressing it. His fingers moved faster and more powerfully, stretching each note, turning them into a musical story only he could tell. Everything in the classroom, every gaze, seemed to fade away. There was only the music and the powerful feeling rising within him. When the music ended, the classroom was silent. Michael slowly stood up, his hands still resting gently on the piano keys. The entire class sat motionless, an astonished silence hanging in the air. There were no claps, no laughter, just confused stares, eyes unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Then, a single clap echoed from the back of the room. Ms. Williams stood there, arms still crossed, but it was clear that something had shifted in her gaze. "Not bad," she said, her voice still calm, but there was something different in her tone. Michael didn't know if she was truly impressed, but he didn't need recognition from anyone else but himself. He had done it, and that was what mattered most. As the applause began to spread from the back of the room, Michael felt lighter than ever. He looked around and noticed that the gazes weren't filled with prejudice or scrutiny anymore. People seemed to have woken up, looking at him like someone new, no longer the quiet, nameless student. They were looking at him with surprise, even respect. Tyler, the friend sitting next to him, finally couldn't contain his astonishment. "You're really good, Michael," he exclaimed, a wide grin on his face and his eyes wide open. "I didn't think you could pull that off. You made all of us sit still." Michael smiled slightly, as if all the tension had melted away. But inside, there was still a hint of surprise. The feeling was similar to when he played in the living room, his fingers gliding smoothly across the keys. But this time it was different. He was playing for the whole class, for Ms. Williams, and that was a bigger challenge than anything he had imagined. Ms. Williams stood still, her gaze still locked on him. After a moment, she cleared her throat and walked over to Michael's desk. The entire class fell silent, as if waiting for a verdict from the teacher. "Michael," she began, her voice no longer cold like before, "you played very well. But today, it's not just about music. You've done something that not many people can do. You've broken the limits that others set for you." She spoke slowly, her eyes looking directly at him, no longer with the sternness she usually had. Michael looked at her, feeling something stir inside his chest. He had never expected her to say this. She had seen him in a different light. That feeling caught him off guard, but also made him feel proud. Now, the looks from his friends, the sneers full of derision from before, were gone. The class was no longer indifferent. They were changing the way they saw him, and that shift held more power than anything. While everyone was still talking excitedly about Michael's performance, he glanced up at the clock on the wall. Only a few minutes left before the bell would ring, but the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The mocking laughter from before was gone. The classroom was no longer a place where he had to sit quietly and silently. It seemed that the whole class now regarded him with the respect he had never received before. Tyler gave him a smile and nodded. "You're the only one who could get everyone to shut up, Michael. From now on, you're not just a quiet kid anymore." Michael smiled but didn't say anything. He had learned that sometimes you don't need to say much for people to know what you're capable of. His talent spoke for itself, and today he had proven to everyone that he deserved to be seen. The next day, Michael felt like he was living in a completely different world. The class was the same as always, but the looks from his friends and Ms. Williams had changed. Every time they looked at him, there was no longer the indifference or contempt. Instead, there was curiosity, respect, and even admiration. Michael couldn't help but notice the difference. People no longer saw him as the quiet, unnoticed student. He had made his mark. Tyler was the first to talk to Michael when they walked home together after class. "Hey, Michael, play for us again next time." Tyler laughed loudly, giving him a strong pat on the back. Michael just smiled lightly, his eyes lighting up with happiness. He didn't expect yesterday's performance to have such a strong impact. "Yeah, I'll play next time," Michael replied, but inside, his confidence was growing. He felt like he had stepped out his own shadow, like a bird spreading its wings and flying higher. When he got home, Michael dropped his backpack on the floor and went straight to the kitchen. The smell of food wafting from the kitchen made him feel relaxed, as if everything from yesterday until now had been just a dream. His mom, Emily, was standing by the stove, flipping a pancake in the pan. "Well, you're home already." Emily smiled when she saw Michael's bright face. "What happened today?" Michael sat down at the table, looking at the pancake his mom was preparing. He smiled and shrugged. "There's been a little change, Mom. People are looking at me differently now." He didn't need to explain further, as his mom understood. Emily gave a gentle smile, set the pancake down on the table, and sat across from Michael. "You did really well," she said, her eyes full of pride. "You've shown everyone that people don't always understand you right away. Sometimes just one step can change everything." Michael leaned back in his chair, savoring the piece of pancake his mom made. Her words felt like they touched his heart. He had done something he never thought he would. And now, he felt like he wasn't just a student in a classroom, but someone who had made a change. The next day at school, Michael walked into the classroom with a completely different feeling. This time, there were no sneers or silence when he walked in. Instead, there were welcoming looks, nods from his classmates that made him feel more confident than ever. Even Brandon Hall, who had always teased Michael before, seemed surprised. "Hey, Michael," Brandon said, his voice sounding friendlier. "You played well. Didn't think you were that good." Michael looked at Brandon, a small smile forming on his lips. "Thanks," he replied, feeling like he had just entered a new chapter in his life. Ms. Williams stood at the front of class, looking at him strangely. Her gaze was no longer cold like before. Perhaps she had realized that she had been wrong by not recognizing Michael's abilities from the start. But either way, Michael no longer cared what anyone thought of him. He had proven the most important thing. He had value, and he didn't need to rely on others' recognition. With every step he took in the classroom, Michael felt like he was opening a new path, not just for himself, but for everyone who had overlooked him. He smiled, ready to step into a new day, where everything could change with just one brave action. The next day, when Michael walked into the classroom, he could clearly feel the change. There were no more indifferent or contemptuous looks from his classmates. Instead, there was curiosity and surprise. It felt like the whole class was waiting for something more from him. This feeling was strange, but also made him feel like he was living in a new world, one where he was no longer overlooked. Tyler, the friend sitting next to him, couldn't hold back his admiration. "Michael, you didn't just play the piano well. You made all of us shut up." Tyler said enthusiastically, his eyes wide with excitement. Michael smiled and sat down at his seat. "It was probably just luck," he replied, but inside, his confidence was growing like a powerful wave. Ms. Williams entered the classroom, her gaze no longer cold or indifferent. She paused for a moment as she walked past Michael's desk, as if she wanted to say something, but instead just gave him a slight nod before beginning the lesson. Throughout the lesson, Michael no longer felt lost. He engaged in the discussion, answering questions without fear. His classmates looked at him with newfound respect. A few times he caught the gaze of Brandon, who had always been unfriendly before, now looking at him with surprise and even a bit of admiration. Midway through the lesson, as Ms. Williams finished a lecture, she suddenly turned to look at Michael, as if wanting to check again. "Michael, could you play another piece?" she asked, her voice deep and serious, but no longer laced with mockery. "This time, play something you like, not because someone asked, but because you want to share it." The class went silent. Curious eyes turned toward Michael again. He felt a sense of joy and relief rise within him. The feeling now wasn't fear or tension, but completely new confidence. "Thank you. I'll play a piece of class," Michael replied, his voice steady but no longer shaky. He stood up and walked toward the piano, his hands trembling slightly, but his heart was remarkably calm. Michael wasn't just playing music for his teacher or his classmates. He was playing for himself. His fingers landed on the keys with certainty, and the music began to fill the room. This time, no one laughed. The music flowed like a new story, full of emotion. The class was silent, no one daring to breathe too loudly, just listening to each note that Michael played. A few classmates exchanged glances, their eyes full of admiration and surprise. Tyler couldn't hold back, clapping his hands and whispering, "He's really talented." Michael wasn't worried anymore. He didn't need to prove anything further. He had proven to himself that he could overcome all barriers, not because someone asked him to, but because he deserved it. When the song ended, the class fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't rejection or disdain. It was respect, a change in how he was perceived. And then a round of applause echoed, not from just one person, but from everyone in the class. Michael looked around, a small smile forming on his lips. He hadn't just won the battle against his own hesitation, but also conquered the doubts of others. After that performance, Michael felt like he had stepped out of the shell he had been in for too long. He was no longer the one overlooked, the forgotten student. His confidence grew. But strangely, nothing changed drastically except for the new looks he received from his friends and Ms. Williams. The whole class now treated him differently, no longer with indifference or scorn. A few days later, during break, Michael sat alone in a corner of the schoolyard, holding a book, though his eyes weren't focused on the pages. He was thinking about what had happened. Even his mom, Emily, had smiled and told him that he had made the entire school take notice. But that wasn't the most important thing. What mattered was that he had proven to himself that no one could define his worth but himself. Tyler, barely able to contain his excitement, approached Michael during break. "Hey, Michael, can you believe it? Yesterday, Brandon said that you'll be the next one invited to perform at the school festival." Tyler said, slapping Michael's back hard. Michael raised his eyebrows, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You're kidding, right? The school festival. Yeah, seriously, everyone's been talking about you after your performance the other day. You made us all reconsider ourselves. No one thought you were that good." Tyler laughed loudly, his smile full of admiration. Michael felt genuinely surprised. The school had never given him this kind of attention before. He didn't know how to respond, only smiling lightly, though inside he felt a small sense of joy. This hadn't been his original goal. He had just wanted to show himself, and now that had been recognized, even exceeding his expectations. But when he thought about playing in front of the crowd at the festival, his heart began to race. This time, it wasn't just a small classroom. It was a large crowd, maybe even a whole school. Michael wondered if he had the courage to stand up and do it again. But then he remembered the sense of freedom when his hands glided over the piano keys. That feeling was stronger than all the fear. "So you're really going to play?" Tyler asked, his smile filled with excitement, as if Michael couldn't refuse. Michael looked at his friend and nodded. "Yeah, I'll give it a try." Tyler clapped loudly. "Awesome, you're going to surprise us again." Michael looked out at the schoolyard, where groups of his classmates were still gathering and laughing. His mind was full of thoughts about his next performance. But no matter what, he knew this time it wasn't to prove anything to anyone. This was for him. And that was what really mattered. The day of the school festival was approaching, and Michael felt a wave of nervousness rise within him. He couldn't stop thinking about playing in front of such a large crowd. Although he had felt a newfound confidence in the past few days, the thought of standing on stage, under the lights, with hundreds of eyes focused on him, still made his nerves flare up. This was a huge opportunity, but also a challenge he had never faced before. Tyler was there, encouraging him. "Don't worry, Michael. You've done it once. So this time will be nothing," Tyler said, his voice full of optimism. "Just remember why you play. It's not to please anyone, but for yourself." Tyler's words made Michael think. That was right. The reason he started playing the piano wasn't to prove something to others, but to prove it to himself. He just needed to do what he loved, without caring about the judgment or comparisons. He had already overcome the silence in the classroom. Now it was just about facing himself on stage. The day of the festival arrived, and Michael stood backstage, holding the sheet music he had prepared. His nervousness made him breathless, but he was ready. Everyone at school was gathered, and laughter and chatter filled the air. But for Michael, all he could hear was a steady beat at his heart. He took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The bright lights momentarily blinded him, but then he found a point of focus in the crowd. The looks he received were no longer judgmental, but filled with curiosity and expectation. Michael sat at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. A brief silence enveloped the room before the first notes began to play. Michael no longer felt nervous. He had let go of all the fears that had held him back. His fingers moved naturally across the keys, without any hesitation or fear. Each note was a story only he could tell. When the music ended, Michael stood up, his heart still pounding, but this time not out of fear. He had done it. The whole school applauded enthusiastically, but Michael knew that the most important thing was that he had overcome himself. The lesson he took away was, sometimes facing a challenge with confidence isn't about proving it to others, but proving that you can do it for yourself. When you dare to stand up and do what you love, the world won't be a place full of judgment and discrimination, but a place where you can shine. When Michael left the classroom that day, he was no longer the quiet student, unnoticed by anyone, but a confident young man who had surpassed all the limits he had set for himself. The feeling here was no longer fear or tension, but a lightness filled with pride. He had shown everyone that he had value, that he could do things no one thought were possible. Tyler was by his side again, smiling brightly as always, but this time not because of jokes or humor, but out of true admiration. You did great, Michael. We all see you differently now. Michael smiled, but inside there was a warmth he couldn't quite describe. He was no longer the kid people saw through the lens of insecurity or lack. He had proven that just by daring to step out of his fearful shell, by facing challenges, everything could change. When he got home, his mom, Emily, saw the bright smile on Michael's face and walked over to ask, "How was today, son?" Michael put down his backpack and walked into the kitchen with a proud look. "Mom, today I didn't just play the piano for class. The whole school applauded for me." Emily smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, but her voice was strong. "You made me proud. But I know you don't need anyone's praise but your own. Today, you did exactly what you wanted." Michael nodded. The feeling he had now wasn't about being judged by others, but the pride from what he had overcome. He had done it, not just for others, but for himself. That was the big lesson Michael took away from everything that had happened. Sometimes, life doesn't need a lot of external recognition. What's important is that you have confidence, believe in your own abilities, and move forward even when the road ahead isn't easy. When you do what you love, not for someone else's satisfaction, but for your own heart, you'll find true joy and peace. For Michael, what mattered wasn't the applause from the whole school, but that he had risen from his own fears to become the person he had always wanted to be.